Angels, die now!
The legends are true. This world is vast.
Faster than you know, my friend. Our journey begins.
The wind coming down the Bitterroot Pass did not blow. It scraped. It carried the smell of crushed pine needles and the metallic promise of early snow. Gideon Vance sat motionless beside the dying embers of his fire. He was 62 years old. His hands wrapped around the rusted tin of his coffee cup looked like old leather left too long in the sun. The knuckles were swollen, mapped with white scars from decades of pulling rope and hauling salt across the jagged spine of the mountains. Daylight was bleeding out of the sky. For most men, twilight meant it was time to rest. For Gideon, it meant the world was disappearing. Night blindness, a curse he had carried since birth. When the sun dropped below the ridges, his vision did not simply adjust to the dark. It failed. Shadows did not deepen. They became solid walls of black. The trees, the rocks, the narrow trail, everything dissolved into a thick, impenetrable ink. In the dark, Gideon operated entirely on sound memory and guess. And in the Bitterroots, guessing wrong usually meant a long drop and a sudden stop. He fed a dry branch into the coals. Sparks spiraled upward and vanished. 20 feet behind him, tied to a dead ironwood tree, his 3 mules shifted in the cold. Dust rust and trouble. Their packs were heavy loaded with 400 pounds of rock salt bound for the Silverbridge trading post. Gideon's thumb rested on the hammer of the Winchester rifle across his lap. The steel was freezing. He listened. A mountain man learns to separate the sounds of the wild, the snap of a twig from a settling buck, the rustle of brush from a prowling cat. But the sound that came from the trail ahead was neither. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, walking upright, 2 legs, not 4, the crunch of boot leather on loose gravel. Whoever it was knew how to walk on mountain stone, pacing themselves, shifting weight to avoid sending rocks tumbling down the gorge. The footsteps stopped just at the edge of the fire's weak halo. Gideon did not raise the rifle. He did not tighten his grip. He sat perfectly still, his dead eyes staring into the blackness. Silence stretched. The wind howled through the granite teeth of the pass. Then a voice. It was female, but it carried the rough, vibrating depth of gravel sliding over a tin roof. It was not a voice used to begging. It was a voice used to giving orders, worn down by exhaustion. "May I warm up by your fire?" Gideon did not ask who she was. He did not ask if she was alone or if she was armed. Out here, questions were a waste of breath. A person out in the Bitterroots after sundown without a fire was a person 2 hours away from freezing to death. His scarred left hand moved away from the rifle. He reached beside him, picking up an iron skillet holding the remains of his venison and bean stew. It was cold, but it was food. He slid the heavy skillet across the flat rock toward the edge of the firelight. It scraped with a dull, heavy sound. "Eat," Gideon said. His voice was cracked, dry as old timber. From the darkness, a massive silhouette shifted. As the figure stepped closer, the wind shifted direction. It blew from the stranger toward the mules. Suddenly, the night exploded into chaos. Dust let out a high, terrified bray. Russ slammed his hooves into the dirt, pulling violently against the hitching rope. Trouble, the largest and meanest of the 3, reared back, eyes rolling white in the dark, snapping his jaws. They had caught a scent, the scent of an apex predator. The heavy wooden branch of the ironwood tree groaned. Trouble threw his entire 600-pound weight backward, trying to snap the leather tether. Gideon started to rise his hand, instinctively grabbing the rope end near his boot, but he was too slow in the dark. The stranger moved. It was not a human movement. It was a blur of raw, terrifying kinetic force. The massive shadow crossed the 20 feet of camp in 2 strides. A hand large and thick with muscle clamped down on Trouble's leather halter. The mule bucked, kicking out with enough force to shatter a man's ribs. The stranger did not flinch. She simply planted her boots into the frozen dirt and twisted her wrists downward. The sheer mechanical leverage, backed by terrifying physical strength, forced the massive animal's head down. Trouble let out a whistling snort and froze his knees, buckling slightly under the pressure. "Easy," the gravelly voice commanded. It was not soothing. It was absolute. The mule stopped fighting. Dust and rust quieted, trembling, stepping back into the shadows. Gideon remained by the fire. He could not see what had just happened, but he heard it. He heard the sudden shift of weight, the brutal, effortless subjugation of a feral animal. No human woman had that kind of strength. Very few men did. The figure released the mule and walked slowly back to the fire. She sat heavily on a rock opposite Gideon. He heard the scrape of the tin spoon against the iron skillet. She ate quickly, methodically, without making a sound of pleasure or complaint. They sat in silence for hours. The fire burned down to a red glow. Gideon slept sitting up, his chin on his chest, his rifle on his knees. He did not know if he would wake up with his throat cut. He accepted the risk. In the mountains you shared the fire. That was the law. What happened after was up to God. Dawn did not arrive with warmth. It leaked over the jagged peaks like dirty bathwater, turning the sky a bruised, freezing gray. Gideon opened his eyes. The blackness slowly receded, giving way to shapes, then outlines, then details. He looked across the white ash of the dead fire. She was sitting exactly where she had been the night before. Gideon did not gasp. His expression did not change, but his jaw tightened. She was an orc. She sat nearly 7 feet tall, her broad shoulders wrapped in a tattered, heavy wolf-hide coat. Her skin was the color of bruised moss, thick and leathery. 2 lower tusks protruded past her scarred upper lip. But it was her face that told the real story. It was a map of violence. Jagged white lines crossed her cheeks and neck. Her dark hair was shaved close on the sides, braided tightly down the back. A massive rusted iron cleaver rested in a leather sheath strapped to her thigh. She was looking right at him. Her eyes were deep amber and completely devoid of fear. Orcs were a myth to city people, a nightmare to homesteaders. They were tribal, brutal, and fiercely territorial. They moved in war bands. They never traveled alone. And above all, they carried a distinct heavy musk, a scent of pine resin, dried blood, and earth that marked their clan allegiance. Gideon inhaled slowly. The air smelled of wood smoke and frost. Nothing else. She had no scent. A clanless orc, an exile, a ghost. "You're an orc," Gideon said. His voice was flat, stating a fact, not a judgment. The orc did not blink. She leaned forward, resting her massive, calloused forearms on her knees. "And your eyes are dead," she said. Her voice was a low rumble. "When the fire popped last night, you looked at the sound, not the spark. When I grabbed your mule, you aimed your rifle at where I was, not where I stood. You can't see in the dark." Gideon stared at her. He felt a cold prickle of vulnerability at the base of his neck. For 30 years, he had hidden his blindness from every trader, every bandit, every guide on the trail. This creature had stripped him bare in 5 minutes of firelight. "Night blind," Gideon said. He did not offer an excuse. He did not offer an apology. The orc nodded slowly. "I am Varka." "Gideon." He stood up. His joints popped stiff from the cold. He walked past her, deliberately turning his back to her, and began checking the straps on the mules. Trouble gave a low, nervous grunt as Gideon tightened the cinch around the saw packs. "You travel alone," Varka said, watching him. "A blind man on a mountain that kills men who can see." "I see fine when the sun's up," Gideon grunted, pulling a heavy leather strap tight. "And I don't need a babysitter. Move on. The trail goes north and south. Pick one." Varka did not move. She watched his hands. She saw the tremor in his fingers. She saw the deep white scars across his knuckles. "The wind changed an hour ago," Varka said. She pointed a massive green-skinned finger toward the northern peaks. "Look at the ridges. The clouds are dropping. It's not frost today. It's a whiteout. A blizzard." Gideon paused. He squinted at the horizon. The sky was turning a sickening shade of violet. The air pressure was dropping rapidly. He felt it in his bad knee. She was right. A bitterroot blizzard. If it caught them in the open, they would be frozen solid by midnight. "There's an overhang 3 miles up." Gideon set his mind racing, calculating distance and speed. "If we push the mules, we can make it." "We?" Varka asked. Gideon stopped. He looked back at her. She was a monster to the rest of the world, a walking death sentence. But she had quieted his mule, she had predicted the weather, and she hadn't killed him in his sleep. "I have salt to sell in Silver Ridge," Gideon said. "I can't afford to bury it in the snow. You want a fire tonight, you carry a pack." Varka stood up. She towered over him. Without a word, she walked to dust, untied a 50-pound sack of salt from the mule's saddle, and threw it over her massive shoulder like it was a bag of feathers. They marched. For the first 2 hours, the trail was wide enough for a wagon. Gideon led, setting a punishing pace. Varka walked behind him, silent her heavy boots, leaving deep impressions in the frozen mud. The mules followed heads down, sensing the urgency in the air. By noon, the temperature plummeted. The first flakes of snow began to fall. Not soft drifting flakes, but hard-biting crystals of ice driven by a rising crosswind. It stung Gideon's face like buckshot. He pulled his wool collar up, his eyes watering. By mid-afternoon, the snow was blinding. The trail disappeared under 2 inches of white. The wind roared a deafening shriek that drowned out the sound of the mule's hooves. Gideon's lungs burned with every breath. He kept his eyes locked on the faint indentation of the path, relying on decades of memory. Then the trail vanished. Gideon stopped. He wiped the ice from his eyebrows and peered through the swirling white chaos. A massive wall of gray stone blocked the path. A rock slide, fresh. The boulders were the size of cabins, completely burying the day route. Gideon's heart dropped into his stomach. His breathing hitched. Varka stepped up beside him. The snow was piling on her broad shoulders, but she did not seem to feel the cold. She looked at the rock slide, then up at the jagged cliffs above them. "Blocked," she yelled over the wind. "I can see that," Gideon barked, panic starting to claw at the edges of his mind. "There is an other way," Varka said. She pointed to a narrow ascending slit in the rock face to their right. It was barely a goat path carved into the side of a vertical cliff. It climbed up and around the rock slide. Gideon looked at it. The path was 2 feet wide. On the left, a solid wall of granite. On the right, a sheer drop into a canyon so deep the bottom was lost in the mist. "The night route," Gideon said, his voice barely a whisper. "It takes 2 hours to cross," Varka said. Gideon looked at the sky. The blizzard had completely blotted out the sun. The light was failing fast. In 30 minutes, it would be pitch black. "No," Gideon said. He took a step back. His hands began to shake. "No, I can't. Not that trail. Not in the dark." "If we stay here, we freeze," Varka said. Her voice was calm, brutally calm. "If I walk up there in the dark, I fall." Gideon snapped, his voice rising, cracking with an emotion he had buried for 10 years. "I'm blind, damn it. I step 1 inch to the right, I'm dead. The mules go over. I go over." Varka turned to fully face him. She reached out. Her massive, heavy hand grasped his shoulder. The grip was iron, but it was not violent. It was an anchor. "You will not fall," Varka said. Gideon looked up into her amber eyes. The snow whipped between them. "How do you know?" Gideon asked, his voice trembling. "Because I will be in front of you," Varka said. "I will tell you where to step. I will tell you when to stop. You will listen to my voice, and you will live." Gideon stared at her. To trust a stranger was foolish. To trust an orc was suicide, but to trust anyone to guide him blindly across a 2-foot ledge over a bottomless pit, that was asking a man to tear out his own instincts and hand them over. 10 years ago, a different mountain, a different blizzard. His brother Arthur walking ahead of him, the sun dropping, the blindness taking over. "Hold up, Gid. Let me find the rope." Gideon had frozen. 3 seconds of hesitation in the dark, fumbling for the coil of hemp at his belt. A crack of loose stone, a shout cut terribly short. Then just the wind. Gideon closed his eyes. The memory tasted like copper and bile in his throat. He opened his eyes. The light was almost completely gone. The gray world was turning into a charcoal smear. The blindness was coming. He unbuckled the Winchester rifle from his back and slid it into the saddle scabbard on trouble. He wouldn't need a gun. He needed his hands. He walked to the front of the line. "Take the lead rope," Gideon said, his voice hollow. Varka took the thick leather strap attached to Dust's halter. She looked at Gideon. The last traces of daylight died. The world went instantly, completely, suffocatingly black. Gideon was plunged into the void. He was standing on a mountain in a blizzard, and he could see absolutely nothing. Panic flared in his chest, hot and violent. His breathing turned ragged. He reached out blindly, his thick fingers scrambling until they found the rough, freezing granite of the cliff wall on his left. He dug his nails into the stone. "Gideon." The voice came from the dark ahead of him, low, heavy, grounded. "I am here," Varka said. "Keep your left hand on the wall, your right hand on the mule's pack. Step when I step." Gideon swallowed hard. His mouth was entirely devoid of moisture. "Go," he rasped. The sound of Varka's heavy boots scraping on the stone. "Straight path, flat rock, 3 steps, Varka commanded. Gideon forced his right foot forward. His boot hit solid rock. He slid his left hand along the freezing wall. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. Stop, Varka said. Gideon froze. He could hear the wind screaming to his right, pulling at his coat, trying to drag him into the abyss. If he leaned an inch to the right, he would drop into nothingness. His knuckles were white. His jaw ached from clenching. Slight left curve. The path narrows. Put your shoulder to the rock, Varka instructed. Her voice was a steady drumbeat in the chaos of the storm. Slide your feet. Do not lift them. 10 paces. Gideon turned his body sideways. He pressed his cheek, his chest, his hips against the freezing granite wall. He slid his right boot forward, scraping the rock, then his left. He counted in his head. 1, 2, 3. The mules followed blindly behind him, the clinking of their harnesses, the only sound besides the wind. 4, 5, 6. Gideon's breathing was incredibly loud in his own ears. Every muscle in his body was locked in a state of titanic tension. The darkness was heavy, pressing against his eyeballs. He felt dizzy. The vertigo of knowing there was a drop just inches away from his right heel was paralyzing. He stopped. He couldn't move his right foot. His boot was glued to the stone. I can't, Gideon gasped, his chest heaving against the cliff knees. I can't see. I'm going over. I'm going over. The wind roared. Gideon. The voice was right next to him. Varka had stepped back. He felt the massive, heavy warmth of her presence just inches from his face. You are not falling, she said, her voice dropping to a low, resonant hum that cut straight through the panic in his brain. The wall is solid. The ground is flat. I am looking at your feet. You have 6 inches of stone to your right. You are safe. Arthur, Gideon whispered into the dark, his mind fracturing under the terror. I couldn't find the rope. I couldn't find it. A heavy leather-clad hand pressed flat against the center of Gideon's chest. The physical contact was shocking. It was immense. It pushed him firmly back against the wall, grounding him. I am not Arthur, Varka said, and I do not need a rope. I am looking at the path. Breathe. Gideon took a shuddering breath. The smell of the freezing air filled his lungs. The heavy hand on his chest did not move. It was a physical anchor in a world of pure black. Step, Varka commanded softly. Gideon slid his foot forward. Step. He slid the other. For 2 hours they moved like a single organism through the void. Varka's voice became Gideon's entire universe. Step wide. Watch the ice. Duck your head. Halt. He stopped thinking. He stopped remembering. He simply became a physical extension of her commands. The mules followed, trusting the man who was trusting the monster. The wind began to die down. The screaming howl faded to a dull roar, then to a low whistle. The freezing rain stopped lashing at Gideon's face. The path widens, Varka said. Her voice sounded further away. The wall is ending. We are in a cavern. Stop. Gideon stopped. He reached out with his left hand. The wall was gone. He reached down with his right foot. The ledge had opened up onto flat, even ground. His knees buckled. He hit the dirt hard, his hands digging into the dry, dusty floor of the cave. He was shivering violently, not from the cold, but from the sudden catastrophic release of adrenaline. He stayed on his hands and knees, staring into the impenetrable black, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He heard the heavy thud of Varka dropping the salt pack. He heard the rustle of dry wood. A moment later, a spark clicked. Then another. A small flame flickered to life. The orange light pushed back the darkness. Gideon blinked, his eyes stinging. He was kneeling on the floor of a massive, shallow cave. The mules were standing quietly behind him, covered in a thin layer of frost. And 10 feet away, kneeling by a small pile of burning kindling, was Varka. The firelight caught the deep scars on her face. Her breathing was entirely steady. She did not look exhausted. She did not look frightened. She looked at Gideon, her amber eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Gideon slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position. His hands were still shaking. He wiped the freezing sweat from his forehead. He looked at the cliff ledge they had just crossed, a jagged crack in the stone that disappeared into the blackness outside the cave. He looked back at the orc, a creature bred for slaughter, in exile, a monster. She had just carried a blind man across a tightrope of ice in the dark using nothing but the sound of her voice. Gideon reached out with his trembling hand, picked up the iron skillet from his pack and set it on the rocks near the growing fire. He pulled a wrapped brick of dried meat from his coat and tossed it across the flames. It landed perfectly at Varka's boots. He did not say thank you. The words were useless. He simply looked at her, the firelight casting long shadows against the cave walls. Tomorrow, Gideon said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. You take the heavy pack. Varka looked at the meat, then up at the old scarred man. The corner of her tusked mouth twitched just a fraction of an inch. Agreed, she rumbled. The fire burned. The darkness remained outside. But inside the cave, the cold began to die. The morning came not with sunlight, but with a slow, begrudging thinning of the gray. The blizzard had blown itself out overnight, leaving the Bitterroot Mountains buried under a foot of fresh, blinding powder. Inside the cave, the fire had burned down to white ash and a few stubborn orange coals. Gideon Vance sat beside them. He had not slept. A man does not sleep after giving up his eyes to the dark and his life to a monster. He just waits for the dawn to prove he is still breathing. He looked across the embers. Varka was already awake. Or perhaps she had never slept either. She sat cross-legged, her massive, green-skinned hands methodically rubbing coarse snow over the rusted steel of her massive cleaver, cleaning it. Gideon's eyes moved downward. He looked at her boots. They were military-issue ones, was so. Heavy leather reinforced with iron plates at the toe. But that was years ago. Now they were falling apart. The heavy stitching on the left boot had blown out completely, exposing the thick gray wool sock underneath. She had wrapped it tightly with strips of raw hide, but the ice was getting in. A mountain doesn't care how strong you are. It doesn't care how many men you've killed or how much weight you can carry. If your feet freeze, you die. It is a slow, quiet death, and it always starts with the boots. Gideon stood up. His knees popped. His back ached with a dull, persistent throb. He walked over to Trouble, unbuckled the leather saddlebag, and pulled out a heavy canvas roll. He carried it back to the fire and unrolled it on a flat stone. Inside were a dozen steel needles thick as finishing nails, an iron awl, and a spool of heavy hemp thread coated in beeswax. Gideon sat back down. He looked at Varka. "Take it off," he said. Varka paused. Her amber eyes flicked from the canvas roll to Gideon's weathered face. She did not ask why. She did not argue. She set her blade down, reached to her massive calf, and unlaced the ruined boot. She slid it off and tossed it across the ash. It landed at Gideon's feet with a heavy thud. Gideon picked it up. The leather was freezing stiff as wood. He ran his calloused thumb over the blown seam. He didn't speak. He just went to work. He drove the iron awl through the hardened leather, the muscle in his forearm cording with the effort. He threaded the needle and pulled the waxed hemp through the hole. He pulled it tight. So tight the leather groaned. He did it again. And again. The rhythmic sound of the needle punching through hide and the hiss of the waxed thread filled the cave. Varka watched his hands. She saw the scars, the swollen knuckles, the slight tremor that he suppressed every time he pulled the thread taut. These were not the hands of a warrior. They were the hands of a man who had survived by refusing to quit. 20 minutes later, Gideon bit the thread, tied off a heavy knot, and tossed the boot back. "The cold makes the leather brittle," Gideon said, packing up his needles. "Keep grease on it. Bear fat if you can find it. Pine pitch if you can't." Varka caught the boot. She inspected the seam. The stitches were ugly. They were thick, brutal, and completely lacking in grace, but they were strong enough to hold a wagon together. She pulled the boot on. She laced it tight. She stood up, testing her weight. The seam held perfectly. She looked at Gideon. She didn't say thank you. The Bitterroots had no use for polite fiction. "Pack the mules," Varka rumbled. "The snow is deep. We will lose time." They marched. The silence between them was no longer the silence of two predators circling each other. It was the silence of two workhorses pulling the same plow. Gideon led during the day, reading the dips and curves of the mountain terrain hidden beneath the snow. Varka walked behind her heavy strides, packing down the snow for the mules. By midday, the sun broke through the clouds, glaring off the pristine white snow with an intensity that made Gideon's eyes water. They reached a narrow plateau bordered by sheer rock walls. Gideon called a halt. His lungs were burning, the thin air taking its toll on his 62-year-old chest. He leaned against Dust's saddle, wiping sweat from his forehead, despite the freezing temperature. He reached into his heavy wool coat and pulled out a map. It wasn't paper. Paper didn't last a week in the mountains. It was a square of cured deerskin, mapped out with charcoal and berry ink, showing the hidden passes and water sources between here and Silver Ridge. Gideon unrolled it and laid it flat on a boulder, placing a rock on one corner to keep the wind from taking it. He traced a scarred finger along a jagged black line, trying to calculate how much time the blizzard had cost them. Behind him, Trouble took a step forward. Gideon didn't notice. He was focused on the ink lines. The mule extended his long gray neck. His large, blocky teeth closed around the top half of the deerskin map. Gideon heard the wet tearing sound. He whipped his head around. Trouble stood there, chewing with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a creature that knew exactly what it was doing and simply didn't care. Half of the map was hanging out of the side of his mouth. "Spit it out," Gideon barked, stepping forward. Trouble blinked his large, dark eyes. He chewed faster. He swallowed. A visible lump slid down the mule's throat. Gideon stopped. He stared at the mule. He stared at the remaining piece of the map on the boulder. It showed nothing but the southern foothills, completely useless to them now. 10 years of charting. 10 years of marking every rock slide, every hidden spring, every deadly ravine. Gone. Digested by 600 pounds of stubborn gray muscle. Gideon's shoulders slumped. He let his head fall back, looking up at the harsh blue sky. He didn't yell. He didn't reach for his rifle. The exhaustion of the mountain had worn away his capacity for rage. He looked at Trouble. "Oh," Gideon said, his voice flat, drained of everything but a dry, dusty resignation. "At least tomorrow I won't have to worry if your shit is pointing north or south." Behind him, a sound broke the stillness. It started as a low rumble deep in the chest, like boulders shifting underwater. Gideon turned. Varka had one hand pressed against her ribs. Her shoulders were shaking. She closed her eyes, threw her head back, and laughed. It wasn't a polite sound. It was a booming, uninhibited roar that echoed off the canyon walls. It was the sound of a creature that had not found a single thing funny in a very, very long time. Gideon stared at her. The fierce, terrifying mask of the orc warrior had shattered. For that brief moment, the deep scars on her face shifted, curling upwards. She wasn't a monster. She was just a traveler on a cold rock, laughing at a miserable old man and his idiot mule. Gideon felt the corner of his own mouth twitch. A dry, rusty chuckle escaped his throat. "Don't encourage him," Gideon muttered, turning back to pack up the useless scrap of leather. But the air felt different. The invisible wall that stood between the human and the orc, built by decades of blood and hatred, had cracked. A map was gone. But something else had been drawn in its place. They pushed forward. But the mountain has a way of balancing every moment of warmth with a freezing dose of reality. Late in the afternoon, the trail narrowed again. It curved sharply around a limestone outcropping, hugging the edge of a sheer drop. The wind picked up, biting through Gideon's coat. He recognized this bend. He recognized the shape of the rocks. He recognized the way the wind sounded as it cut through the gorge below. His stomach tightened into a hard, cold knot. He slowed his pace. His breathing grew shallow. He rounded the corner. There it was, a cairn, a small stack of weathered gray stones piled roughly 3 feet high and sitting exactly 2 feet from the edge of the cliff. The snow had covered most of it, but the shape was unmistakable. Gideon stopped. Dust bumped into his back, but Gideon didn't move. He reached down to his belt to unhook his tin canteen. His hands were shaking, not a tremor from the cold. A violent, uncontrollable shaking. His fingers slipped. The tin canteen hit the rocky ground with a loud clatter, rolling toward the edge of the cliff. Gideon didn't try to catch it. He just stared at the stones. Varka stepped up beside him. She looked at the dropped canteen. She looked at the shaking hands of the man beside her. Then she looked at the stones. She did not ask what it was. She knew a grave when she saw one. 10 years, Gideon said. His voice was a hollow whisper, barely carrying over the wind. 3,650 days. Varka remained silent. She stood beside him like a granite pillar, offering nothing but her presence. His name was Arthur. Gideon said, his eyes fixed on the snow-covered rocks. "My older brother. He wasn't blind. He was the one who usually walked point when the sun went down." Gideon's jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables. It was a storm, worse than the one we had yesterday, black as pitch. He was walking ahead. He turned back and said, "Hold up, Gid. Let me find the rope." Gideon looked down at his own hands, the scarred, calloused hands that had mended leather and hauled salt. "I couldn't see," Gideon choked out the words tearing at his throat. "I reached for the coil on my belt, but my hands were frozen." I fumbled. I hesitated. 3 seconds. That's all it was. 3 seconds. He looked back at the cairn. I heard the rock give way under his boot. I heard him shout my name, and then I heard nothing. Gideon fell silent. The wind whipped around them. "You blame yourself for the stone breaking," Varka said. It wasn't a question. "I blame myself for the 3 seconds," Gideon said bitterly. "If I had the rope ready, if I wasn't blind, if I wasn't useless when the sun goes down, I could have thrown it. I could have caught him." He closed his eyes. "I didn't lose him," Gideon whispered. "I dropped him." Varka looked at the old man. She saw the crushing weight he carried, a weight heavier than any pack of salt. He had built this grave. He had stacked these stones, and for 10 years he had walked past it, torturing himself, paying a penance to a mountain that didn't care. Varka stepped forward. She reached down and picked up the tin canteen from the edge of the cliff. She brushed the snow off it. She held it out to him. "The stone broke," Varka said, her gravelly voice cutting through the wind. "The mountain took him, not you." Gideon opened his eyes. He looked at the canteen, then up at her scarred face. "You do not honor the dead by bleeding for them every day," Varka said quietly. "You honor them by surviving." Gideon stared at her for a long time. His hands slowly stopped shaking. He reached out and took the canteen. He hooked it back onto his belt. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once. A short, sharp jerk of his chin. He stepped past the grave and kept walking. But the mountain wasn't done with him. The light began to fade earlier than expected, blocked by the towering peaks to the west. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the trail like dark fingers. Gideon's vision began to fail. The edges of the rocks blurred. The snow lost its contrast, turning into a flat gray sheet. He was walking on memory and instinct, his mind still heavy with the ghost of his brother. He didn't see the patch of black ice hidden beneath a thin layer of powder. His right boot hit the ice. It slipped sideways. All of Gideon's weight came down at a terrible, twisted angle. A sound cracked through the cold air. A wet, heavy pop, like a green branch breaking over a knee. Gideon went down hard. He hit the stone shoulder first, the breath blasting out of his lungs. A blinding spike of pain shot from his right ankle, burning straight up his leg into his spine. He rolled onto his back, his hands instantly clutching his knee, his jaw locking tight to hold in the scream. Gideon Varka was there in a heartbeat. She dropped to one knee beside him, her massive hands already reaching for his leg. "Don't touch it," Gideon hissed through gritted teeth. His face was entirely devoid of color, pale as the snow around them. Sweat broke out on his forehead. Varka ignored him. Her heavy, leather-clad hands moved down his shin with surprising gentleness. She felt the joint through the thick leather boot. "It is not broken," Varka said, her voice calm, assessing. "But the joint is torn, dislocated, and sprained." Gideon let his head fall back against the freezing rock. He closed his eyes. He knew what a torn ankle meant out here. It meant the end. A man who cannot walk cannot survive the Bitterroots. He becomes dead weight, and dead weight gets left behind. It was the brutal, unspoken law of the trail. "Leave the salt." Gideon rasped, his breathing shallow from the pain. "Take trouble. He can carry you. Leave dust and rust with me. I have enough dried meat for a week. Someone will come down the pass." It was a lie. No one was coming. They both knew it. Varka looked down at him. Her amber eyes narrowed. Without a word, she stood up. She walked over to Dust. She unbuckled the heavy salt packs from the mule's saddle, lifting the 100 pounds of dead weight as if it were a blanket. She walked over to Trouble, who snorted in protest, and strapped the extra weight onto his already heavy load. She walked back to Gideon. "What are you doing?" Gideon ground out. Varka leaned down. Before Gideon could protest, she slid her massive arms under his back and under his knees. With a grunt of effort, she stood up, lifting the 200-pound man off the ground as easily as a child. "Put me down, damn it!" Gideon snarled, his pride flaring even through the blinding pain. "I am not a sack of grain." You are an idiot, Varka rumbled, walking toward Dust. If I leave you here, you freeze by midnight. I am not digging another grave on this mountain. She hoisted him up and set him gently into Dust's saddle. Gideon gripped the saddle horn, his knuckles turning white as a fresh wave of agony washed over his ankle. He looked down at the orc. I slow you down, we both die, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Varka met his gaze. Her scarred face was immovable. Then we both die, she said simply. She turned, picked up the lead rope, and began to walk. Gideon sat on the mule, staring at her broad back as she broke the trail through the snow. The pain in his leg was a constant, searing fire. But something else burned in his chest, a strange tight knot that had nothing to do with the cold. He was 62 years old. He had lived his entire life believing he had to earn his right to exist every single day. He had to be useful. He had to be strong. The moment he wasn't, the world would discard him. This creature, this outcast, owed him nothing. He was useless to her now, a liability. Yet she pulled him forward. They made camp in a narrow defile, just as the true darkness set in. Gideon could not help with the fire. He sat on his bedroll, his back against a stone wall, his teeth chattering as the adrenaline crashed out of his system. The fire flared to life. Varka knelt beside him. She had heated a canteen of water over the flames. She pulled a ragged piece of wool from her pack, soaked it in the hot water, and wrung it out. Take the boot off, she said. Gideon didn't argue. He unlaced the boot with shaking hands and slid it off. His ankle was grotesque. Swollen to twice its normal size, the skin a horrifying shade of purple and black. Varka wrapped the steaming hot wool around the joint. Gideon hissed his head, thumping back against the rock. The heat was a shock, but slowly it began to draw the deep throbbing ache out of the torn muscle. Varka sat back on her heels, watching the compress. As she shifted her weight, her heavy wolf-hide coat opened slightly. Something slipped from the inner pocket. It hit the stone floor of the cave with a heavy metallic clink. Gideon's dead eyes turned toward the sound. He couldn't see it, but he heard it, the sound of heavy forged iron. He reached out his hand, his thick fingers brushing the cold stone floor until he found it. He picked it up. It was heavy, solid iron. His thumb traced the outline. It was roughly 3 inches long, jagged at the top, curving down to a sharp point, the shape of a wolf's fang. But it wasn't just a shape. His thumb found the deep engravings cut into the center of the metal. 3 horizontal slashes intersected by a vertical line. Gideon's breath stopped in his throat. He had never seen one, but he had heard the stories around 100 campfires. Every trader, every trapper, every soldier in the territories knew the mark. It was the insignia of an Iron Fang commander. The Iron Fangs, the most brutal, relentless clan of orcs in the northern ridges. They did not take prisoners. They did not negotiate. And their commanders were the architects of massacres that left entire settlements burning. Gideon held the badge. His thumb rested over the 3 slashes. The creature sitting less than 3 feet away from him was not just an exile. She was a warlord, a general of a slaughterhouse. Varka did not move. She did not reach for her cleaver. She simply watched his hands. She waited for the realization. She waited for the fear. She waited for the old man to reach for the rifle leaning against the rock beside him. Gideon sat perfectly still. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside the defile. He thought about the grass on the cliff. He thought about the 3 seconds of hesitation. He thought about the massive, gentle hands that had wrapped his swollen ankle 5 minutes ago. He didn't ask how many men she had killed. He didn't ask why she was cast out. Slowly, Gideon extended his hand forward. He held the iron badge out in the empty space between them. Heavy thing to carry, Gideon said softly. Varka's breath hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound. She reached out. Her massive green fingers brushed against his scarred knuckles as she took the badge. She slid it silently back into her coat. It is, Varka rumbled. Gideon nodded. He leaned his head back against the stone. Get some sleep, Gideon said, closing his eyes. Tomorrow's a long walk. The fire burned down to embers. The temperature plummeted. Gideon lay wrapped in his wool blankets, shivering despite the heat of the compress on his leg. The cold seeped into his bones, gnawing at his old joints. He heard the rustle of Varka's heavy coat. He expected her to sleep on the far side of the fire as she had the night before. Instead, he heard the drag of her bedroll. She moved around the fire. She sat down her back against the same rock wall less than a foot away from him. She laid down. The sheer physical mass of her blocked the wind completely. The ambient heat radiating from her body was immense. Slowly, the violent shivering in Gideon's chest began to subside. An hour passed. The silence was absolute. Gideon thought she was asleep. Then he felt a weight. Varka had shifted in her sleep. Her massive, heavy head nodded to the side. It came to rest gently against Gideon's right shoulder. Gideon froze. His eyes were wide open in the dark. A warlord of the Iron Fang clan was sleeping on his shoulder. He could smell the pine pitch on her boots. He could hear the slow, deep rhythm of her breathing. He could feel the solid, undeniable weight of another living soul anchoring him to the earth. Gideon Vance, the man who had walked alone for 10 years, did not push her away. He closed his eyes. He let out a long, slow breath. And for the first time since his brother fell, the old man slept through the night. The Bitterroot Mountains do not negotiate. They only take. But as Gideon Vance rode the sway-backed mule named Dust through the final stretch of the high pass, he felt a strange, quiet defiance burning in his chest. His right ankle was a knot of screaming fire wrapped tight in wool and stiff leather, completely useless. He should have been dead. He was a blind, crippled old man hauling rock salt through a frozen hell. But he was breathing, and the massive silent shadow walking ahead of him was the reason why. Varka did not slow her pace. The snow was knee-deep, but she broke the trail like an icebreaker ship moving through a frozen sea. Her heavy cleaver hung at her thigh. Her broad shoulders cut off the worst of the biting wind. They were 2 miles from the descent, 2 miles from the timberline where the snow would turn to slush and the deadly high-altitude winds would finally break against the pines. Then trouble stopped. The big gray mule planted his hooves in the snow, his long ears swiveled forward, snapping rigid. He let out a low, vibrating snort that shook his massive chest. Gideon felt the change in the air immediately. The hair on the back of his neck stood. He pulled back on Dust's reins. "Hold," Gideon rasped. Varka stopped. She did not turn around. Her head tilted slightly, her amber eyes scanning the jagged white ridges above them. She raised her hand, signaling for absolute silence. The wind shifted. It blew up the pass, carrying a scent that hit Gideon's nose like a physical blow. It was not the smell of pine or snow or wet stone. It was the smell of wet fur, raw meat, and old blood. A low growl rolled down the canyon walls. It did not come from a single throat. It came from 5. Shadows detached themselves from the white outcroppings above. They moved with terrifying, fluid silence, leaping down the terraced rocks until they landed on the trail, blocking the narrow pass completely. 5 timber wolves, each one the size of a draft horse, their coats thick and matted with ice, their jaws dripping with hot saliva that steamed in the freezing air. But it was not the wolves that made Gideon's blood turn to ice. It was the riders on their backs. 5 orc warriors. They wore armor of blackened iron and hardened leather. Their faces were painted with streaks of white ash. They carried jagged spears and heavy curved axes, and they reeked of the clan musk, the heavy suffocating scent of the Iron Fangs. The lead rider pulled his massive wolf forward. He was a veteran, his face missing an eye, his jaw lined with iron piercings. He looked past Gideon. He looked past the mules. He locked his single eye entirely on Varka. "We tracked the stench of a human," the lad rider growled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls in the harsh guttural tongue of the orcs. "But we found a ghost instead." Gideon did not speak the language, but he knew the tone of an executioner. He slowly slid his right hand toward the saddle scabbard where his Winchester rifle rested. "Keep your hand off the iron, old man," Varka said in English, not looking back. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "They are not here for your salt." She took a slow, deliberate step forward, placing her massive body directly between the wolf riders and Gideon. She dropped her hand to the hilt of her rusted cleaver. The lad rider laughed, a harsh barking sound. He switched to heavily accented English, meant for Gideon to hear. "Do you know what walks beside you, human?" The rider sneered, pointing a jagged spear at Varka. "You travel with a coward, a traitor to the blood, Commander Varka of the Iron Fang." Gideon sat motionless on the mule. The pain in his ankle faded, replaced by a cold, sharp adrenaline. She was given an order. The rider spat his wolf, pacing side to side, teeth bared. "A human settlement in the lowlands, 200 lives. It was her command to burn it, to leave no breath in their lungs. And what did the great commander do? The rider leaned forward, his face twisting in disgust. She broke her sword. She opened the gates. She let the prey walk away into the trees. The orc spat a wad of dark phlegm onto the snow. The chieftain stripped her of her scent, stripped her of her clan, ordered us to take her head. We have hunted you for 2 winters, Varka. Gideon stared at her broad back. The stories of the Iron Fang massacres were legend in the territories, but this was a story no one knew. The monster was not in exile because she was too violent. She was in exile because she had refused to slaughter the innocent. She had thrown away her rank, her people, and her home to save a town of humans who would shoot her on sight if she ever knocked on their doors. Varka drew her cleaver. The heavy rusted iron scraped against the leather sheath. The sound was like a tombstone dragging across gravel. "You found me, Garl," Varka said, her voice dropping into a low rumbling register that made the snow beneath them vibrate. "Now see if you can take me." "Kill the human," Garl ordered his riders. "Take the traitor's head." The 5 wolves lunged. It happened faster than human thought. 3,000 pounds of muscle fur and iron exploded down the narrow trail. Gideon did not hesitate. He did not freeze. The 3 seconds that had cost him his brother's life 10 years ago were gone. He ripped his hunting knife from his belt, but he did not aim for the approaching wolves. He twisted in the saddle, driving the heavy steel blade deep into the side of the massive salt pack strapped to Trouble. He yanked the knife downward, slicing a 3-foot gash in the thick canvas. "Trouble, ya!" Gideon roared, slapping the mule's flank with the flat of his blade. The mule bolted forward directly into the path of the charging wolves. As the beast ran, 200 pounds of finely crushed rock salt exploded out of the torn canvas. The freezing mountain crosswind caught the salt, whipping it into a blinding, stinging white cloud of crystalline shrapnel. The lead wolves hit the salt cloud. It blasted into their eyes, their noses, their open jaws. The beast shrieked. It was a terrible, high-pitched sound of pure agony. The salt burned their sensitive eyes and nostrils like acid. The charge shattered. Wolves slammed into each other, rolling in the snow, throwing their riders onto the jagged rocks. Varka moved. She did not fight like a soldier. She fought like an avalanche. She stepped into the chaos of the blinded wolves and scrambling riders. The first orc swung his axe blindly. Varka ducked under the heavy iron, drove her shoulder into his chest, and brought the heavy pommel of her cleaver down on the back of his neck. The sound of breaking bone cracked like a rifle shot. A wolf snapped blindly at her leg. She kicked it in the throat with her iron-reinforced boot, sending it tumbling backward over the cliff edge. Garl, the leader, had managed to stay on his mount. He spurred the blinking, tearing wolf forward, leveling his spear at Gideon's chest. The old man was a sitting duck on the mule. Gideon yanked the Winchester from the scabbard, levered around into the chamber, and fired from the hip. The bullet tore through Garl's shoulder, spinning him backward off the wolf. The beast, terrified by the gunshot and blinded by the salt, bolted back up the pass, abandoning its master. 2 riders were dead. Garl was bleeding in the snow. The remaining 2 orcs scrambled to their feet, their eyes wide with sudden terror as they looked at Varka. She stood amidst the blood and salt, her rusted cleaver dripping her chest, heaving. She looked like the god of death the Iron Fangs worshipped. The 2 riders turned and ran, disappearing into the whiteout of the upper pass. Silence fell over the canyon. The only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of the old man and the exiled commander. "The caves," Varka said, not looking at the bodies. "There is a limestone network a quarter-mile down. We move now. They will regroup and return with more." Gideon did not argue. He spurred dust forward. They left the trail, pushing through deep, untouched drifts of snow. The mules fought every step, but Varka dragged them forward by the halters. They descended into a jagged ravine, the wind dying completely as they stepped under a massive overhang of gray stone. The entrance to the cave was narrow, hidden behind a curtain of frozen vines. Varka forced the mules inside, then carried Gideon off Dust's back, setting him gently on the dry, dusty floor of the cavern. They moved deeper. The light from the entrance faded. After 100 yards, the tunnel turned sharply, plunging them into absolute total darkness. "We stop here," Varka echoed in the blackness. "They will not track us in the dark. The wolves are blind." Gideon sat on the stone floor. He reached out, feeling the cool, dry limestone. He unbuckled his heavy coat. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He listened. In the pitch black, Gideon Vance was no longer a crippled old man. In the dark, the playing field was entirely level. His ears mapped the cavern perfectly. He heard the mules settling against the far wall, their hooves scraping the stone. And he heard Varka. She was sitting 10 feet away. But her breathing was wrong. It was not the steady, rhythmic intake of a warrior resting after a fight. It was shallow, ragged, trembling. He heard the metallic clatter of her cleaver being tossed aside. It hit the stone and slid away. Then he heard a sound he never thought he would hear, a heavy, choked sob, suppressed immediately, swallowed down into the chest, but undeniable. Gideon dragged himself forward. His broken ankle dragged behind him on the stone, sending flares of pain up his leg, but he ignored it. He crawled blindly across the cavern floor until his hand brushed the heavy wolf-hide fur of her coat. She flinched violently, pulling away from his touch. "Do not," Varka whispered. Her voice was broken. The gravelly strength was completely gone. "I am covered in blood. I am covered in the filth of my clan." Gideon did not pull his hand back. He reached further. "They called me a monster," Varka said to the darkness, the words pouring out like a wound that had been tightly bound for years and suddenly cut open. "For my whole life, I was bred to be a weapon. I was taught to hate the smell of human blood. And when I finally refused to spill it, they took my name. They took my scent. They made me a ghost. And now, I have killed my own brothers to protect a man who cannot even see me." She pulled her knees to her chest, a massive, terrifying creature shrinking herself into the smallest possible shadow. "You see a beast, Gideon," she whispered. "You are lucky you are blind. You do not have to look at the monster sitting beside you." Gideon sat up. He leaned against the cave wall, resting his head back. He let the absolute darkness wrap around them. "When I was a boy," Gideon said, his voice quiet, steady, carrying the rough texture of a man who had lived too long. "The other children in the settlement used to hold their hands in front of my face after the sun went down. They would wave their fingers. They would laugh when I didn't blink. They called me a half-wit, an empty vessel, a man with dead eyes." He reached out his scarred, trembling right hand. He moved it slowly through the black air. He found her face. His rough, callous thumb brushed against her jawline. He felt the thick, leathery skin. He moved his hand upward, his fingers tracing the deep, jagged scars that crossed her cheek. The map of her violence. The map of her pain. Varka froze. She stopped breathing. The touch of the old human was light entirely without fear, entirely without judgment. "My eyes are dead," Gideon said softly, "but I am not blind." His thumb rested gently over the deepest scar under her eye. "Your chieftain looked at you and he saw a failure because you wouldn't burn innocent people." Gideon said, his voice tightening with a fierce, unwavering certainty. "The townsfolk look at you and they see a nightmare because of the color of your skin and the tusks in your mouth." Gideon leaned forward in the dark, closing the distance between them. But sitting in this cave, listening to the woman who carried a broken old man up a mountain, who fought a pack of wolves to protect a stranger, who threw away her entire world to save people who hate her, Gideon's hand moved down, resting firmly on her massive armored shoulder. "I don't see a monster," Gideon stated. It was a fact, solid as the granite mountain above them. "I see a commander. I see the bravest soul I have ever met." In the pitch black, the silence was absolute. Then Gideon felt a massive hand slowly come up in the dark. It enveloped his scarred, trembling hand. The grip was tight, desperate, like a drowning sailor holding onto a lifeline. Varka pressed his palm against her cheek. She let out a long, shuddering breath. The tension of a lifetime of exile slowly drained out of her massive frame, bleeding away into the cold stone floor. "I see you, Varka," Gideon whispered into the dark. "I see you." They stayed in the cave for 2 days. They waited out the wolf riders living on dried meat and melted snow. When Gideon's ankle was stable enough to bear a fraction of his weight, they packed the mules and began the final descent. The transition from the Bitterroot high country to the lowlands was jarring. The snow thinned out, replaced by brown mud and dead pine needles. The screaming wind faded into a dull, echoing breeze, and then they smelled it. Wood smoke, unwashed bodies, coal dust, and cheap whiskey. Civilization. Silver Ridge was a sprawling, ugly scar of a town built into the side of a river valley. It was a place of desperate men, opportunists, and hardened survivors. Wooden buildings leaned against each other, connected by boardwalks caked in frozen mud. When Gideon rode dust down the main thoroughfare, the town stopped. Men loading timber dropped their cant hooks. Women carrying laundry baskets froze on the boardwalks. Every eye in Silver Ridge locked onto the massive green-skinned orc walking behind the old blind trader. Hands drifted to pistol grips. Shotguns were quietly lifted from under store counters. The air crackled with a sudden, suffocating hostility. Varka kept her head up. Her amber eyes looked straight forward. She did not flinch, but Gideon saw the subtle tightening of her jaw. He saw the way she unconsciously pulled her tattered wolf-hide coat tighter around her chest. She had saved human lives, but to these people, she was nothing but a target. They reached the trading post. The owner, a fat, sweating man named Carter, stood on the porch wiping his hands on a filthy apron. He looked at the salt packs on the moles, then looked at Varka, his upper lip curling in disgust. "You bring a lot of garbage down from the mountain vans," Carter spat, crossing his arms. "But this is a new low. Get that animal off my porch before I call the marshals." Gideon didn't dismount. He stared down at Carter, his dead eyes fixed on the man's chest. "The salt is pure, Carter," Gideon said, his voice dangerously quiet. 400 pounds. I want $800. Gold." Carter scoffed. "Market's down, 600, and I'm doing you a favor considering the company you keep." Gideon pulled the Winchester from his scabbard. He didn't aim it. He just laid it across his lap. The metallic click of the hammer being pulled back sounded like a cannon shot on the quiet porch. 800, Gideon repeated, "or I take it to the mining camp upriver, and you spend the winter explaining to your buyers why they're eating unseasoned meat." Carter looked at the rifle. He looked at Gideon's face. He saw a man who had left all his patience up on a frozen ledge. "Fine," Carter sneered. He disappeared into the post and returned a minute later with a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it into the mud at Varka's feet. "Take your money and get that thing out of my town." Varka looked at the pouch in the mud. Slowly she bent down, picked it up, and handed it up to Gideon. Gideon took the pouch. He untied the leather string. He poured a pile of heavy, shining gold double eagles into his scarred palm. He counted out 20 coins. $400. A small fortune in the territories. Enough to buy a small piece of land. Enough to retire. He held the 20 coins out to Varka. Varka looked at the gold. She did not take it. "Take it," Gideon commanded softly. "It's your half. You earned every grain of it." Varka slowly reached out and took the heavy gold. The metal looked incredibly small in her massive hand. She closed her fist around it. Gideon turned dust around. They walked away from the trading post, heading toward the edge of town where the tree line began. The hostile stares of the townsfolk followed them every step of the way. They stopped at a livery stable on the outskirts of Silver Ridge. Gideon paid a boy $2 silver to watch the mules for an hour. He leaned heavily on a wooden crutch he had carved in the cave, favoring his ruined ankle. He looked at Varka. The journey was over. The salt was sold. The contract was fulfilled. Varka stood looking back at the town. The smoke from 100 chimneys dirtied the sky. The sound of shouting, of breaking glass, of barking dogs filled the air. "You should buy a room at the inn," Varka said. Her voice was flat, hollow. "Soak your egg. Sleep in a bed." "What about you?" Gideon asked. Varka looked down at the gold in her hand. "I will buy supplies. There is a pass to the north. Uncharted. No towns. I will go there." "Alone," Gideon said. "A wolf cannot live in a sheep pen," Varka said, turning to look at him. The amber in her eyes was dull. The resignation was complete. "This is your world, not mine. If I stay with you, they will eventually try to kill me. And they will kill you for standing beside me. I will not be the reason you dig another grave." Gideon looked at her. He looked at the massive scarred warrior who had carried him, who had bled for him, who had slept on his shoulder in the freezing dark. He looked back at the town. He saw the hateful, fearful eyes of his own kind, people who would never understand the loyalty of a shared fire, people who valued a piece of paper over the content of a soul. Gideon reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of parchment sealed with red wax. His territorial citizenship. the paper that allowed him to trade, to own property, to exist in the civilized world. Beside the livery stable, a burn barrel was smoking, filled with old hay and trash. Gideon limped over to the barrel. He looked at the parchment. Then, without a second of hesitation, he tossed it into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. Varka's eyes widened. "What did you do?" she rumbled, stepping forward. "Gideon, you cannot trade without that paper. You cannot cross the borders." Gideon turned back to her. He pulled his heavy coat tight around his shoulders. The cold wind blowing off the bitter roots ruffled his gray hair. "Town is too loud," Gideon said, his voice cutting through the noise of Silver Ridge like a freshly sharpened blade. He turned and limped into the livery stable. He came out 5 minutes later, leading a massive, sturdy brown mule with a fresh saddle. He handed the lead rope to Varka. "This is Keeper," Gideon said. "He's yours." Varka stared at the lead rope. Her massive hands hovered over it, trembling. "I don't understand," she whispered. Gideon stepped closer. He looked up into her scarred green face. "I've got another load of salt to run to the mining camps in the north," Gideon said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "The trail is bad, the passes are narrow, and the blizzards are rolling in early." He reached out and tapped the wooden crutch against the dirt. "I know the day, Varka," Gideon said, his voice dropping, filled with a quiet, earth-shattering conviction. "But my eyes are dead. I need someone who knows the night." Varka stared at the old man, the human who had just burned his only tie to civilization. The man who was choosing a life of freezing wind, deadly drops, and constant danger just to walk beside a monster. A single tear, thick and hot, broke over Varka's lower eyelid. It tracked down her green skin, running through the deep scar on her cheek before dropping into the dirt. She did not wipe it away. She reached out and took the lead rope from his hand. Her fingers brushed his. "The night is dangerous, old man." Varka rumbled, a faint, beautiful tremor in her voice. Gideon Vance looked up at the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. He felt the cold wind on his face. He felt the solid, undeniable presence of the orc standing beside him. "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore," Gideon said. He turned, swung himself up into Dust's saddle, and spurred the mule forward. Varka fell in step beside him. They did not look back at the town. They walked away from the smoke, the noise, and the safety of the sheep pen. They walked back toward the timber line, toward the freezing wind, toward the place where fire asked no questions about who sits beside it. 10 years later, the Bitterroot Mountains had not changed. They were still brutal, unforgiving, and silent. A young trader, shivering in his heavy coat, pulled his frightened horse along the narrow, 2-foot ledge of the night route. A late-season snowstorm had forced him off the main trail. He was terrified. The drop to his right was bottomless. He rounded a sharp curve in the rock wall. He stopped. There, sitting exactly 2 feet from the edge of the cliff, was a cairn, a small stack of weathered gray stones, but it was not abandoned. The young trader stared in awe. The snow around the cairn was packed down. Someone had been here recently. In the center of the stones, a fresh bundle of dried mountain sage had been placed, tied carefully with a heavy waxed hemp thread. The trader looked down at the ground. Leading away from the grave, heading deeper into the impossibly treacherous mountains, were 2 sets of footprints. One set belonged to a man. The boots dragged slightly on the right side, the unmistakable gait of someone walking with an old ruined ankle. The other set of footprints was massive, deep, the stride of a giant wearing heavy iron-reinforced boots. The footprints walked side by side, perfectly parallel, the small steps trusting the massive ones, the massive steps guarding the small ones. The young trader knelt in the snow. He had heard the legends in the taverns of Silver Ridge. Everyone had. The stories of a blind old man and a terrifying orc warlord who roamed the high passes. They called them the Eyes of the Bitterroot. They said if you were lost in the dark and you were worthy, they would find you. The wind howled through the gorge. Somewhere miles above, in the freezing blackness of the high peaks, a spark clicked against flint. A small orange flame flickered to life in a dark cave. It illuminated the scarred face of a warrior, and it illuminated the deep, quiet, unbreakable smile of an old blind man. The fire burned, and the darkness stayed outside.